All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. We got one bill before us today. Welcome to the Transportation Committee. They're working on a PowerPoint. Before we get started, though, we're going to ask Representative Fry, if he would, to lead us in a word of prayer.
Y'all bow your heads. Dear Lord, we thank you for this day. We thank you for getting us all here safely this morning. And please bless us with wisdom as we make the decisions that will affect the lives of the people in this great state. And please bless everybody in this room. In your name we pray. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Representative. All right. Mackenzie, will you hand me the clicker for the PowerPoint? All right, I'm not going to go back through the entire presentation on the bill. We're going to have time for public testimony. But we did make a few changes that I want to mention. One, I don't see Representative Garner, but there was some folks that raised the issue around having a pilot in the 13-county metro area. A lot of the pilots we're talking about were outside of Atlanta, specifically in rural Georgia. So we did add in hold on just a minute. I believe we got I'll talk about it for just a minute. We added in a pilot program dealing with a 13-county region. One of the things that we hear, especially from North Fulton, for instance, is around last-mile connectivity. And one of the things that we wanted to be able to do in conversations with the governor's office and others is to be able to have some incentives and some studies around how do we address last-mile connectivity. Is this the right one? All right. And you see that there, on-demand transportation services. The idea here is that the pilot program would look at three $500,000 grants. These grants would be around people who could put together a plan that would do one of three things. Number one, they would be able to connect last-mile connectivity, utilizing the private sector, incentivizing the private sector, and working with the private sector, public-private partnerships. Also looking at low-income, underserved areas around Atlanta that doesn't have access to transportation, and how to move those folks to jobs and to educational opportunities. And then three, one of the other things that Chairman Beach talked a lot about during last session was the disconnect between transit services, where if you go from one service to the other, there may be a gap. We want to be able to look at ways to close that gap. So this would create, again, just a 3-year pilot program that the governor and the commissioner would be able to determine and work with and see how it's going to function. And if it works, then the governor, through the budget process, could come back to the Appropriations Committee to ask for ongoing funding. So that's the third pilot program. And again, that was an area that we added in as a result of some conversations. I also want to mention you have the substitute there in front of you, LC 392191S. I want to mention a couple of other things that is not in this substitute, but after we take public testimony, I would like for you to consider as amendments. One is, and I appreciate Uber's cooperation. Uber and Lyft have been good partners in putting this together, and Uber issued a statement this week supporting the legislation, and I appreciate that, and Lyft has indicated their support to me verbally. But Uber did find one thing they recommended changing, and I have talked with Legislative Counsel Jenna, who's in another meeting. She's supportive of this change. It doesn't change the intent. They just want to make sure that our intent of the 50-cent fee is followed through. So this would add on page 12, section 48-13-143, It would add under, I think it's lines 374, Article 1 of Chapter 8, where we've got struck of this title, that would remove that. And then also 375, it was struck defined in Code Section 48-8-2. So again, it has no effect on the intent of the legislation. And again, Leg Council's reviewed that and is good with it. So as we, before the end of the meeting, we'll bring that back up. The second thing for consideration that did not get into the substitute on line 806, what we just talked about around the pilot program of the award, we want to add in up to 3 grants to make it clear that this is 3 grants, 3 locations. The idea is to do those in 3 separate parts of the Metro Atlanta area, so all those funds do not get used in one place. The third change, the third amendment, would be around, and I know we'll hear from Commissioner McMurray, but one of the things, he and I have had some conversations around the legislation, and one of the concerns that was raised is the intent of the excess toll dollars at CERTA. The way it works today, CERTA has a board. The governor chairs the board. The speaker, the lieutenant governor each appoint a member to that board, and then Commissioner McMurray serves on the board, and also the director of planning for GDOT, who's appointed by the governor, serves on the board. And CERTA, the CERTA board can determine where those revenues go. But the intent of this legislation is not to change that, and it's also not to use these funds to build rail or to buy buses or to pay ongoing costs for transit operations. The intent would be, if we're doing a managed lane project, say 400 or 285, and the governor chooses that he would like to incorporate BRT, Bus Rapid Transit, into that project, that if the CERTA board voted to do that, then they could utilize some of those funds to pay the capital cost providing that, to building that infrastructure out. But again, not ongoing cost of operations, not to build rail, not for trains, not to buy buses, but the capital cost itself. So we have, at the end, I'll read you the suggested language. So with that, I know we have some folks that would like to speak. I'm not sure if Chelsea, we do have a sign-up list. I think up first we have Vicki Johnson with the Georgia Council on Aging. If you would just come up to the podium.
Good morning. Thank you for this opportunity to be with you so that we can speak on behalf of the Georgia Council on Aging in support of this bill. We support this bill because we think that it will bring expanded mobility for older adults. We know that they tell us that transportation is a very high priority. They do that in surveys, they do it in community meetings, they do it at COAGE, our Coalition of Advocates for Georgia's Elderly. Why do they think it's so important? Because it connects them to what we call social determinants of health. Access to medical providers and groceries and pharmacies and community services. We know that lack of transportation can result in isolation, and that will often lead to depression and declining health. Seniors usually outlive their ability to drive. Women outlive it by 11 years, and men by 6 on the average. Another factor is that modern family models have changed. Whereas older adults used to be able to rely upon family members for transportation, families are smaller and they are more geographically dispersed. So when you add the factors of age and lack of family support, and then low income and poor health and rural or suburban residents, then you have a lot of unmet transportation needs. So the question is, how much unmet need? Well, DHS commissioned a report, and it was published in December of 2018, and it was compiled by the Georgia Health Policy Center of Georgia State University. And they were called to do a study of all 12 regions of the state served by area agencies on aging. And this report is very detailed for each region of the state. But the thing that struck me is that it identified 200,000 older adults aged 70 plus who have unmet transportation needs in Georgia. And this is after they looked at those who are already being served by Medicaid non-emergency medical transportation and by the DHS Coordinated Transportation Program. 200,000 older adults. So we support this bill because we support public policy that expands mobility for older adults. And we think that HB 511 will move Georgia in that direction, and we ask for your favorable consideration of the bill.
Are there any questions? Thank you, Ms. Johnson. We appreciate you and appreciate you being involved with us last year and what your organization does for many of our citizens here in Georgia.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right, next is Tom Bauer with the Georgia Transit Association.
Good morning. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. I'm Tom Bauer with the Georgia Transit Association. We're the spokesman association for 120 transit systems in Georgia. As a longtime advocate for transit and working with the GTA, I'll just hold it. I'm really excited to be here to endorse this bill. We want to thank Chairman Tanner for all his hard work and his thinking outside the box. In particular, House Bill 511 addresses some of the more major portions of our legislative agenda this year, and these are several issues which have been around for a while. Just to be brief, coordinating transit and human services transportation, providing governance and assistance to Georgia's rural transit systems. We really appreciate also your looking at the small urban area issue and amending last year's 930 to deal with single county T-SPLOS. We're very appreciative of that. And you had, Mr. Chairman, you had a question you had mentioned in your earlier presentation about an appeal process to the commissioner if the advisory council, is that in this bill?
Yes, sir, that is. That's been changed.
Well, we appreciate that as well. Thank you for listening to our input on that. And last but not least, certainly a state revenue source for transit so that Georgia can join the other populous counties in the United States doing that. So that's about really all I want to say. This bill completes the cycle that you started last year with the ATL, and we very much appreciate this bill and strongly ask your support.
Thank you. Any questions? All right, thank you, and thank you for your organization. All right, next up is Kathleen Bowen, ACCG.
Hello, Kathleen with ACCG, and I'm bringing up our partners in good government. You want to speak first, Tom?
I'm joining our partner in good government, Tom Gale with the Georgia Municipal Association. I've had another meeting, so I was a little late.
It's very nice to see ACC and GMA standing together.
Anytime we can, we're trying to do that. Anytime we can. We've already done it this morning, haven't we, Tom? Okay, so ACCG does support this bill. One thing that we particularly like is the mobility managers that will be put in the regions. That's putting state resources closer to the people, and they're going to have input from our local elected officials as well. And we have been asking for some technical support for counties that would like to get into transit, or it's pretty intimidating for some of our counties that do not have transit. They don't even know how and where to start. So this is a good resource by putting these mobility managers in their communities. I think these mobility managers will get to know the community, will be able to provide some technical assistance that we think is pretty important. Another thing, we do like the single county transit option. It is different from the single county transportation SPLOS because that one can only go for 5 years. this option, this bill, does go to 30 years, and that 30 years is in there so you have a better chance of drawing down the federal funds. So we do like that you're adding to the local government funding toolbox. So I'll pause there.
I just want to also endorse the legislation. GMA supports the legislation, and after last year with House Bill 930, we thought you can't outdo yourself, but I think you have on House Bill 511, because it really is going to help the majority of our members with some of the transit solutions. So I commend the legislation and commend the chairman for putting this together and the work of the House Transit Governance Commission.
Any questions of our friendly cooperative government partners that are working together for a better Georgia?
Yes.
Somebody might need to take a picture. All right, thank you, and appreciate all your organizations do. All right, next up is Commissioner McMurray, Georgia Department of Transportation. Commissioner.
I would say the only thing that made that better if they rode MARTA together this morning. I would like to recognize our chair of the State Transportation Board, Ann Purcell, being here with us today in the audience. And dear Chairman Tanner and ladies and gentlemen of the Transportation Committee, thank you for allowing me to address you today on behalf of the State Transportation Board for the Georgia Department of Transportation in regards to HB 511. Thank you in advance for your careful review and deliberation of this bill. First, let me say that the State Transportation Board, the department, and I commend Chairman Tanner and this committee for all the work, a lot of hard work indeed, to improve transportation for Georgia. This committee has wrestled with difficult challenges and found solutions, and I have no doubt that this will be the aim of HB 511. So I come here today in a spirit of offering some areas of opportunity from the department's perspective for changes to the bill. I understand that the legislative calendar is very short and crossover day is Thursday. This process will need to move forward. Please rest assured that the department stands ready to work constructively with the House and the Senate over the coming weeks as this bill is continue to be perfected. I want to be on record of this committee's prior support of GDOT in addressing funding and governance from HB 170, HB 930, and now of HB 511. GDOT is fully committed to be efficient and effective in delivering all transportation plans and programs. And I want to underscore that GDOT is a multimodal agency. We're the Department of Transportation with a capital T. That includes transit to aviation, roads and bridges, ports, waterways, freight rails, bike ped, etc. The department takes seriously its responsibility to all modes of transportation. In fact, I missed your meeting last Thursday because I was in D.C. meeting with the U.S. Department of Transportation, sharing an innovative approach about broadband, and also presenting Georgia's innovation in connected autonomous vehicles that we're the nation's leader in. And also was recognized by U.S. DOT Secretary Elaine Chao as Georgia being one of the most innovative DOTs in the nation in front of 49 of my counterparts. I got a little ribbon for that later, but it was a real point of pride for GDOT to be acknowledged as such. And again, I would just like to emphasize the department's name of transportation, which exemplifies a multimodal department. As you know, yesterday in a special call board meeting, the State Transportation Board passed a resolution in regards to HB 511. The board's resolution enumerated several concerns with certain tenets of HB 511, but also highlighted and acknowledged the chairman and the leadership in his leadership in transit, and supports many parts of HB 511, as well as GDOT being ready, willing, and able to implement a vision of improved multimodal mobility. I feel it's important today that you hear GDOT's support and concern while you deliberate and potentially amend this bill. Let me assure you that each and every day we at GDOT focus on collaboration, innovation, to serve the citizens of Georgia to the very best of our ability. At the heart of HB 511, GDOT stands in full support to advance all transit, especially rural transit. Let me get down to some details and facts that I think are important, and I'd like to address them in three broad areas. First would be transit funding, next would be rural small urban transit opportunities, and lastly would be the creation of the new government agency. So first, transit funding. It's important to understand that Federal Transit Administration funds come to Georgia in several federal programs. GDOT administers 6 FTA programs, FTA funding is a reimbursable program. Transit planning or actual service providers bill GDOT. GDOT pays the bill and then seeks a federal reimbursement. Even though FTA programs are called grants, please understand that the funding is reimbursable. Federal funds generally cover 80% of capital projects, but only 50% of operations. Currently, Georgia does not provide any match to local government providers for operations. And I can tell you that most of the counties that do not have transits because they can't afford the 50% match. GDOT administers $47.3 million of FTA funds between capital and operations combined. New fund sources may allow the leverage of additional federal capital programs, which have traditionally been 50-50, but more recently about a 30% share. Operational funding programs are limited to Georgia by formula, so there are no additional leverage for federal funds for operations. I'm unsure of what the net increase of funding may be from the conversion of the sales tax to the ride share fee that's been talked about, but that dedication is very welcomed. The $30 to $60 million that I've heard would go a very long way compared to the $2.3 million of state general funds appropriated to GDOT today. That $2.3 million funds basically 23 staff to administer the $47 million in federal transit administration funds. I recognize that some conclusions have been drawn that GDOT's transit program is less of a priority due to its program size or the number of staff as compared to other modes. I would also offer that GDOT has maximized the transit program based on available annual appropriations, again, $2.3 million. And I implore you to think about how much innovation GDOT has deployed since HB 170 passed in providing more funding with the smallest headcount in our history. I would request your deliberation in some portion of that the ride share tax be dedicated to transit operators, which would incentivize more participation. The most limiting factor in transit grants or expansion is the ability to cover future operational costs. From my interpretation of HB 511, it appears silent if any ride share fees are to be used for actual transit operations. Often it's observed by many transit funding conversations around the country and around Georgia is about funding equity. I would recommend careful deliberation be given to equity of the utilization of the rideshare fee. GDOT is subject to congressional district balancing for equity purposes. My understanding from HB 511 would be that the commissioner would decide where the funds are allocated. Since the majority of the rideshare tax is generated here in Metro Atlanta, it's unclear the allocation to large urban transit, small urban providers, or rural transit operators. HB 511 is innovative in regards to the pilot programs, and we just heard about the additional pilot program for transit vouchers for the unemployed or underemployed, and the tax credit program for businesses that provide transit to employees. I would commend the chairman on these items. By the way of comparison, I would inform you that a person that drives 15,000 miles a year with a vehicle that gets 20 miles per gallon only pays about $18 a month in state excise tax. So the proposed $100 tax credit per employee is a bold step to incentivize companies. I know that there are many companies here in Metro Atlanta that provide shuttles to and from MARTA for their employees, and this could really help and encourage more MARTA riders, but just importantly to rural agribusiness employers as well. My understanding is the pilot would be in one mobility zone chosen by the Transit Link Division. The Transit Link Council, then made up of agency heads, including Commissioner of DOT, would advise the Transit Link Division on the implementation of such programs. Another very positive part of HB 511 is the change in Transit T-Splosh that's been talked about. Allowing the single county Transit T-Splosh will provide increased likelihood of passage, potentially in places like Athens and other small urban areas. I remind you that even the basic T-Splosh, the regional T-Splosh that it is, allows for transit projects and programs, but for only 10 years or 5 years, as you know. One success previously is Columbus, Georgia, where they took advantage of capital expansion and operations in their regional T-Splosh. The other three TIA regions have not chosen transit projects, but could obviously use their 25% discretionary funds for transit. The single county transit T-SPLOS change is very good, and I commend you for that. Let me move to rural small transit opportunities with HB 511. GDOT fully supports the tenets of HB 511 dealing with small urban and rural planning and governance, the mobility zones. GDOT has a good working relationship with the 100+ transit providers, including 3 regional commissions that deliver transit. GDOT is charged and held accountable by FTA for compliance by each county or regional commission. This duty is critical to preserve a place of good standing with the U.S. Department of Transportation, not just the Federal Transit Administration. The idea of mobility zones will aid in the overall awareness and engagements of counties and municipalities in the planning process. This is a welcome outcome from the House Transit Commission's work. As I mentioned, GDOT staff and I participated in the House Commission meetings. One of the earliest conversations and barriers to efficiently and effectively delivering rural transit was identified, which dealt with the funding. The challenge lies with all the different rules and regulations from the federal fund sources. The PowerPoint slide used in those commission meetings was called the spaghetti chart because the federal funding flows look like a plate of spaghetti. Basically, you have multiple FTA programs and Federal Department of Health and Human Services, which is Medicaid and other programs, which all have different regulations and rules. GDOT, DCH, and DHS were motivated from the commission meeting to see how we could streamline rural on-demand trips. And I emphasize that rural trips are almost exclusively on-demand trips and not fixed routes where buses, on a traditional bus schedule. GDOT, DHS, and DCH have partnered on a pilot that would build on the work of the commission. The pilot would allow each agency to contract with a regional commission that already delivers FTA transit trips for 12 counties. The regional commission then contracts with a single transit provider, which makes a one-call center for dial a ride no matter what the federal fund source. Through our software programs, the ride can be billed on the back office to the correct federal fund source. It's a way to consolidate trips, but not consolidate agencies. It would maintain each agency's critical federal compliance role to USDOT or to DHHS. This proposal fits nicely in HB 511 Mobility Zones proposal and the Mobility Manager proposal. We would be glad to share more about this in the future, but please understand the consolidation of the agency does not allow for consolidation of federal funds. One suggestion regarding the mobility zone plans is to ensure a provision is made for home rule. A single county passes a transit T-SPLOS, but they have to be allowed to choose their projects, which may not be included in the mobility zone plan. I believe this was discussed and already discussed today in the chairman's presentation that the new commissioner could allow for this, but did not see it specifically in 511. This, of course, does not apply to the ATL mobility zone due to the ATL governance. Let me move now to the proposed new agency. I appeal to you to think about Georgia's future, not this year, but for the long term. Just in the last few years, the last of the old state highway departments from across the nation all became departments of transportation. I feel that we're the most engaged in advancing transit at any point in history at GDOT. The collaboration and leadership on the State Route 400 Express Lane project is a great example, and the communication has been amazing. Here are a few specific areas of concern. We were asked to provide information about the consolidation of transit staff, vehicles, and equipment to the new agency. We provided this information, but also included a disclaimer that other non-FTE functions would not or could not be included. Should you go forward with the new agency, please understand it will probably take more employees than listed, just as the direct people dealing with transit. I say this cautiously, of course. Just a few examples are accounting, financial management, audits, IT, procurement, HR functions that are shared across GDOT's administration. All of this is part of our staff all of this includes our staff that are spread across the 6 GDOT field districts, excluding Metro Atlanta. As affirmed in State Transportation Board resolution, we oppose moving Georgia DOT transit staff to the new agency so that to maintain a full multimodal agency. GDOT has significant concern in relation to the changes to State Road and Tollway Authority. Those changes are removing CERTA from being administratively attached to GDOT and moves them to the new agency. GDOT has enjoyed a long-standing administrative attachment to CERTA all the way back to the 1950s when it was the State Toll Bridge Authority. In more modern times, Georgia and CERTA are shoulder to shoulder in delivering our biggest and most innovative projects like the I-85 Express Lanes, I-75 Express Lanes South, the Northwest Corridor, and 285. The reason for this concern is critical role CERTA plays for GDOT in our ability to deliver large programs like the Major Mobility Investment Program. CERTA plays two main roles for GDOT. It holds our federal debt for using federal bonds and loans, and is the contract owner for multi-year contracts of GDOT's P3 and MMIP projects. In doing so, GDOT funds the debt repayment, some $239 million a year for FY19. Currently, we fund CERTA's operations on average of about $10 million per year, and we also fund the Georgia Transportation Infrastructure Bank at $12.9 million per year from state motor fuel funds. We fund the capital cost of CERTA on most all projects as well. Of specific concern is that the use of toll revenue is part of GDOT's financial plan to help fund the MMIP projects and the current express lane operations of I-75 and I-85. One concern with the language added that would allow the DMI and CERTA to use toll revenues to fund transit, even though GDOT used constitutionally dedicated fund sources of motor fuel to fund the operations and capital. There would be obviously concerns of excess toll revenue to be used for transit vehicle operations or rail infrastructure, of which the chairman and I have been working on yesterday and even this morning. So I thank the chairman for his openness to understand and to listen to those suggestions. So thank you, Chairman. If no longer attached to GDOT, appropriations from GDOT would have to be made to the new agency, then flow to CERTA. In my understanding is legally we would need a contract for things like annual appropriations and funding GTIB. This seems to complicate what is now a solid business model. It appears that HB 511 gives the new agency, should it go forward, other means which to finance projects without needing to move CERTA. I believe that GDOT and CERTA will always work much more closely together than a new transit-focused agency. I argue that GDOT's MMIP is the most multimodal approach to provide improved transit operations in Metro Atlanta that we've ever seen. As affirmed by the State Transportation Board in the resolution yesterday, I ask for your consideration to remove these changes from CERTA from HB 511. I would like to conclude my comments by saying GDOT is fully committed to making sure we are a multimodal agency and are focused on moving transit ahead. We have a proposed pilot project that works well with the Mobility Zone concept, and GDOT supports and applauds this committee for the bold action of increasing funding for transit, which will allow Georgia to expand transit options. I would ask this committee to deliberate carefully over the 68 pages in this bill, and I know the legislative calendar is very tight, but rest assured that the department stands ready to work constructively with the House and the Senate on the coming weeks as this bill is perfected. I truly appreciate the work of this committee and of Chairman Tanner and Speaker Ralston's support of this bold transit initiative. Thank you very much for allowing me to speak.
All right, thank you. Any questions? All right, thank you, Commissioner. Just a few things that I didn't mention earlier in changes. The governor's office had asked for several changes in their review of the bill, and we made those in the substitute you have in front of you. One, they pointed out that direct appointments of the governor did not require Senate confirmation. We had that in here. That was just an oversight, so we removed that. They also, there was some language that was picked up from the revenue commissioners in the revenue bill that would require that this person not be able to run for office if the commissioner left service. They asked that be removed because that was not consistent with other commissioners across the state government. They also, a couple of other things, one other thing the governor's office asked for was, since these director positions under the commissioner dealing with things like CERTA and other things, they wanted the governor to ultimately have to approve that appointment before it was approved. So the commissioner would recommend the director of CERTA, for instance, but the governor would ultimately have to make that final approval. All of those changes were made at their request. Also, one other thing that the commissioner brought up that I want to make sure is clear in the substitute you have in front of us, at the request of places like Chatham, Savannah, Athens, Clarke, they wanted to make sure if they were in a situation where their regional commission denied their ability to go out for a transit splosh, that they had a right to go directly to the state, and they do that in 511. We felt like that was important, and that's based on if they're in an MPO. So if they're a large city that has an MPO, they can go directly to the state if denied at the local level. Also, I want to make sure it's clear that the commissioner of this department, like all of our departments that answer to the governor, will not be able to decide how funds are spent. Those funds would be subject to the appropriations process on an annual basis. The governor, through submitting his budget after consultation with the departments, will submit a budget to the General Assembly, which will take into account this revenue source. And based on the governor's recommendations, the Appropriations Committee and ultimately this House and the Senate will determine what this agency's budget is. It's not, commissioner will not get to decide on his or her own how that money is spent. And let me also say this. I told Commissioner McMurray this yesterday. I think we have the best commissioner we've ever had in the Department of Transportation. He and I work very closely together. We agree on most everything, most all the time. And I understand when we start talking about changing how the bureaucracy works, there's always some concern with that. The function of CERTA today is that they are the arm of the state. They are an authority created by the state that's distinct and separate from a state agency. They have to be that way because they have the ability to bond, enter into contracts without obligating the good the funds of the state government. We're not putting up the good faith and state of the state when they do these private partnerships, and that's important. So they are administratively attached, but they are a distinct authority set up by state law. And currently, I did make one. I said the director of planning, but it's actually the director of OPD is on their board. But that board makes the decisions on where those funds go. In this legislation in front of you today, that does not change at all, other than the fact that they'd be administratively attached to a new agency, and they would have the governor ultimately and that board would have some other options available. Having said that, after we have some discussion, I do agree that we need to tighten the language down around those funds. It's always been my intent that those funds be used to, first of all, pay debt service on our toll projects. That's the most important thing. Number two is to maintain those roads that were built by toll dollars, and then to build other roads. And then if we're going to have excess funds available, then if the governor and the CERTA board decides to use those funds, that they would be used for capital projects only, not for operational costs, not to build rail, not to buy trains, not to buy buses. So we'll offer that up at the appropriate time. Having said that, that's the last speaker we have, so I'm going to open it up to the committee for discussion and questions or conversation. Chairman Harrell.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As you mentioned with your relationship with Commissioner McMurray, my relationship with yours is equally as strong. I respect all that you've done and the time and effort you've put in here. I have not read all 72 pages of your substitute, but I have confidence that what you've included is searching to do good for our state. Much of the discussion this morning I appreciate, and I think the idea of putting mobility officers throughout the state is very good. Looking at local transit programs is a very strong initiative. My comments this morning are with regard to funding this program. We've heard some speak of the word dedication. Until Chairman Jay Powell's bill becomes law, there is no dedication of funding in Georgia. These funds are not dedicated to transit. The bill uses a similar mechanism that we used in House Bill 170, which says this per ride fee would be allocated through the appropriations process to transit. Failing to do that in the first year, the fee would be cut in half. Failing to do that in the second year, the fee would go to zero. So there is no dedication. I agreed with the premise that transportation and transit is a core function of government, and we had been underfunding for years, and we needed to fund it. And I supported House Bill 170 to put funding into transportation, and Georgia DOT has a significant larger amount of funding today as a result of that. This bill does not increase funding, it does the opposite. It reduces funding that would otherwise be available for allocation to the general fund, as these funds are allocated, for any projects, including transportation and transit projects. The rideshare companies support this measure because it reduces their obligation to the state that exists today through the next few years by some $20 to $30 million per year. So if you would like to put additional funding into transit and transportation projects throughout this state, I would suggest that the current tax structure in place today on those services is the appropriate tax structure to generate the necessary revenues to fund what appears to be an outstanding proposal to spread transit dollars throughout our state. So I have no comment with regard to the transit proposals, the way you've established the mechanism to address both large and small communities throughout the state. But I think we should tread very carefully on a significant change in tax policy that I believe over time reduces revenue to the very problems we're trying to solve.
All right, thank you. Couple of things. I think you will agree with this. You can correct me if you do disagree. Currently, the rideshare companies, Uber and Lyft, have not been paying this fee. I think there's an argument that you and I probably would agree on that they would owe those dollars. In their opinion, they don't and haven't been paying it. So the state has not been collecting those dollars. If the state does charge companies like Uber and Lyft 7% or whatever that tax rate is, and I know we have representatives from the companies in the room, and they can correct me if I'm wrong on this, we would be the highest taxed fee for rideshare companies in the entire country. Again, looking at Georgia trying to partner with the private companies to create partnerships, having the highest tax rate in the country could be detrimental. And third, and again, I think you would agree with this, we're underspending on transit today. If we increase revenue, and our state revenue has increased over the last several years, we as a General Assembly have a lot of priorities. There's a lot of need in the state. And I agree, constitutionally, we can't dedicate revenue. However, House Bill 170 has worked. All the money from hotel motel tax, all the money from the electric car fee, even though we could make a decision through the appropriations process not to appropriate those funds that way, we have. So it's clear that that was the intent of those of us who served when we passed 170, and we have stuck to that. And I believe that if we pass this legislation with the same language, future legislators will do the same until Chairman Powell's bill passes, and I support that because I do think what we tell our citizens we're going to spend money on is exactly what we should spend it on. So my thoughts would be if we don't do this and we go forward, and I know you had a proposal that passed yesterday that would capture Uber, Lyft, and many other companies who currently are not paying sales tax, that we'd have the highest tax rate in the country. And number two, that money would go into the general fund. and that because of all the other priorities, we would not see an increase in tax dollars going to transit services. And we definitely would not be able to fund the innovation that we're proposing in this bill because of all the other priorities. So again, I respect your opinion, and I appreciate the job you do on tax policy in our state and the way you're leading the Ways and Means Committee. So thank you. 25, is that you, Representative Smith?
It is. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate all the hard work on this. I'm new this year as a freshman, but trying to catch up.
Is that
True statement?
Was that sarcastic?
No, that wasn't. I was being sincere. I'll have to fault myself from years ago in certain positions I've been in here before and other places that, being from rural Georgia, I have not worked hard enough for rural transit. Our state continues to grow. We have a lot of needs out in rural Georgia. I appreciate the opportunity to look at this type of legislation. Just one question to make sure we're all clear, I guess myself clear, everybody else may be. The role of SRTA now and how that rolls into this piece of legislation.
The role of SRTA remains the same. The change is that it's administratively attached to GDOT, and that administrative attachment moves to this agency. The idea there is the director of SRTA today is also the director of the ATL and also the director of GRETA, which we're doing away with GRETA in this legislation. And the ATL director and the SRTA director becomes the commissioner of this department. So the administrative attachment would change over to this. Now, because of that, the governor and the SRTA board, when they're looking at projects, they could choose to put dollars in to some type of mobility project, excuse me, mobility project. And again, I think that's where, and again, Commissioner McMurray and I have had conversations last night and this morning about tightening that down, because it's not, again, not my intention that we're going to fund operations cost or that we're going to be building rail, because Chairman Harrell and I have had this conversation a lot. Some people in the room will disagree with this, but I think we both feel like that technology is going to be a thing of the past and that we need to be looking for innovation and move people in different ways. So I'm not interested in us spending our state dollars on that. So anyway, but SRTA remains exactly the same. It's controlled by the exact same people it is today, chaired by the governor and with the other folks we mentioned.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Representative Al Williams.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for your work on this bill, and certainly we thank GDOT for all you do. I'm looking at this bill, and I'm cautiously optimistic when it comes to the mobility zones, because in my lifetime I've seen a great highway system, sometimes greater than others, that has been in rural Georgia. But unfortunately, no matter how good the road is, if you hadn't got any way to get on the road, it is of no use to you. And rural Georgia has reached the point that we're going to have to be from Montana, and it's going to have to be shown to us that folk are going to be able to move from point A to point B in a workable rural transit system, because I have watched the hoopla, and I'm so happy the concentration on rural Georgia. But the average rural Georgian isn't a lot better off today than he was 2 years ago when it comes to moving around in this state and getting to work, unemployed, needing to go to work. And hopefully these mobility zones will begin to not just look good and sound good at 6 o'clock, but work good for the people that need transportation in this state, the underemployed, the unemployed, veterans, poor folk that we have just kind of moved from one spot to another. And it's one thing to keep getting an aspirin when your arm needs fixing, and we're waiting on the set. As I'm telling you, I'm full of aspirins, and I travel all over this state, and folk are not happy that we continue to make headlines and we don't significantly improve the needs of the average rural Georgian that's really, really hurting. Rural Georgia is a unique place. If you got plenty of money, you can go to Martha's Vineyard. If you're broke, you can't even get to the county seat. And hopefully we can change that, because right now you got to be dirt poor to be picked up by Medicaid transportation, or you're just out of it. So let's be cautiously optimistic. Thank you for this bill. It is a step in the right direction. I do agree that there's some things that have to be addressed, but that's part of making sausage, and that's why we got different brands of it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Representative Williams. All right, I know some of us have rules, so at this time I'm going to offer or put out one at a time suggested amendments and see if there's anyone that'd like to make a motion. The first one deals with the conversation that Commissioner McMurray and I had that he mentioned and I mentioned earlier. And this, in essence, will set up a priority order for excess toll dollars to be used, or toll dollars to be used, which would be satisfaction of any provisions of a resolution authorizing the issuance of bonds or trust indentures securing the project for which the toll is collected. So that would be the number one priority. Number two priority would be satisfaction of any debt service on the project for which the toll is collected. So that would be the number two priority, is paying the debt service on that particular road. Number three would be maintenance of the project for which the toll is collected. So maintaining that roadway would be the number three priority. Number four priority would be any other public road or transit projects as determined by majority vote of the board, provided that such use is not towards rail infrastructure, transit vehicle, or transit operations. So again, we're looking at capital infrastructure only. And then also that this would be subject to the terms of any resolutions or trust indenture authorizing the issuance of revenue bonds, and upon concurrence by the governor, purposes relating to projects or operations of service transportation or capital infrastructure for mass transportation would exclude rail, transit operations, and transit vehicles. And then 8 would be subject to the terms of any resolution of trust indenture authorizing the issuance of revenue bonds, and upon concurrence by the governor, the transfer of funds to the Department of Transportation to be used by the department for the purposes related to projects or operations of surface transportation or capital infrastructure for mass transportation, excluding rail infrastructure, transit operations, and transit vehicles. And that language has to be placed in a couple of different places in the law. And I have a printout from Leg Counsel. She was not able to be here this morning due to another meeting with the language that Commissioner McMurray and I worked on with Leg Counsel this morning. So, Commissioner McMurray, does that sound? That's okay. All right. Is there any questions on that, or understanding the intent of what we're doing? All right. Is there a motion to accept the amendment? Is there a second? All right. Any discussion of that amendment? If not, all those in favor, aye. Aye. Any opposed? All right. That would be the first amendment. All right. The second one is, I mentioned to you about the third pilot program we talked about at the beginning of the meeting. There was some, we left out on lines 806 that this would be up to 3 grants, and also on lines 807 and 808 that would be no more than $500,000 each. So I want to make it clear that this is up to 3 separate grants, no more than $500,000 each. And that line's on 806, 807, and 808. To make sure that's clear in the language. And again, that was just really a scribbler's error more than anything else. But is there a motion to accept that amendment? Second. All right. Any discussion? All those in favor, aye. Any opposed? All right. That one's approved. All right, the next one is around language around the rideshare fee. Section 48-13-143 that's added. I believe it's on lines 370 through 375. The suggestion here is on lines 374 to strike the word. It says Article 1 of Chapter 8. And we would leave the word of this title, but it would strike if such service was provided by a dealer as term is, and lines 375 strike defined in code section 48-8-2. Again, Chairman Harrell, this would go to something that you'd probably be in opposition of, but this makes it clear that what we're doing is the 50 cent replaces sales tax. That's the intent that's the intent of 511 in the language, and that would be further clarifying it with the amendment. So it does not change the intent of what the understanding has already been presented, but I just wanted to let you know that. Yep, yes, sir.
What lines are those again, Mr. Chairman, because this is going upside down what I have here.
Yeah, let's see. Let me. Yeah, that's probably. Let me see if I can find it real quick. I think it's in the old version. Give me just 1 second, if you would. I've got the old version of the bill. It was lines 371, but again, I think that's the old. In the new bill, 384. Yeah. If Lewis, you're here, you're representing Uber, and I know this request has come from the attorneys at Uber. I want to make sure I'm correct in this. This is actually changing existing language in the code today, not necessarily just in 511, but this is striking this in the code. And again, I apologize, and this is in current code 48-13-143. Am I correct in saying that?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. The idea is that as originally in the bill, written in the bill, it mentioned the word dealer. Mm-hmm. And as Chairman Harrell well knows, there's a disagreement on whether or not rideshare companies are dealers under the law. So the suggestion was to take that out, the few words that included the word dealer, so that it could move ahead with a 50-cent fee without judging ahead of time whether or not the current litigation goes one way or the other related to the dealer for sales tax purposes.
And in conversations with Leg Counsel to make sure that didn't have any other unintended consequences, she said no and was fine with it. But that's the intent. Any other questions that Mr. Massey can answer while he's there around this? All right. All right. Again, that's the proposed amendment. Is there a motion to accept that? We have a motion. Do we have a second? Second. Motion and a second. Any discussion? All right. All those in favor, aye. Aye. Opposed? All right. Now we move to the bill. This would be opening the floor for motions to do pass for substitute House Bill 511 as amended by this committee, the three amendments. Is there a motion? All right, we have a motion. Do we have a second? Motion and a second to approve as amended by this committee. We'll do this as a hand vote. All those in favor, aye. All right. All those opposed? All right, motion carries. Bill moves forward. Thank you again. Thank you for everyone that was here, and thank you, committee.